Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Gospel of Luke. And today we come to Luke chapter 14, verses 15 to 24. When Jesus mentions the resurrection of the righteous, he gets quite a reaction from one of the other guests who's been invited to this Pharisee's house for a meal. And he says, "Blessed is the man who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." He's referring to the concept that the Jews refer to as the Messianic banquet. And you can read all about that in Isaiah 25, verse 6. But what happens next would have taken this guest and everyone else by surprise. The phrase "to have the rug pulled out from under you" is when something completely unexpected happens. We think we know where a conversation's going or an action's going, but then something completely out of the blue happens. And that's what very much happens now when Jesus tells this parable. He tells of a man who is throwing a great banquet. He says in verse 16, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests." Now, this is a man of influence. It's a great banquet. He's sparing no expense. He's invited many people. That takes money, doesn't it? And when the time is right, he sends his servants out to call the people to the banquet. Now, the way things worked in the ancient Near East was people would have known the time of the banquet, but because of the preparation and the way things worked in those days, they would have known it probably would have been towards evening, but they wouldn't necessarily known when. And so they would have known there would have been a 2 or 3 hour window when they were expecting to go there. But they all know the banquet's on. They've all been invited. They've all accepted. But then when the servant goes to these people, he gets a very, very disappointing response. Verse 18 and the verses afterwards. "But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field. I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I have just got married, so I can't come.'" Now, as we said, they all knew the day. And there were plenty of times to make arrangements. I mean, the guy must have known when he was going to get married. I would have thought so. There were other times to go and look at a field. It seems a bit strange this bloke hadn't looked at the field before he'd actually bought it. What about this yoke of oxen? Wouldn't he have tried them first? And getting back to the man who's just got married, couldn't he have just taken his wife? They all knew. They'd all been prepared. But the point is, they refused the generosity of this man. The servant goes back to his master and, to put it mildly, when he reports all this to his master, it says the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, "Go quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor and crippled, the blind and the lame." The guests who were invited were going to be replaced. They were going to be placed by people who probably would have been seen as less worthy. Well, the servant goes and does what the master said, but when he's done it, there's still room. Then, verse 23, the master told his servant, "Go out onto the roads and the country lanes and make them come in, so my house will be full." Do you notice the difference there? The first time he goes out into the streets of the town or the city. And this being a parable, that's a picture of perhaps the less worthy people in Israel, as these Pharisees would have seen it, being invited. But then he goes out to the country. This is a picture of outsiders being brought in. And here's the bit that really would have pulled the rug out from these Pharisees sitting around listening to Jesus. Verse 24, the master says, "I tell you, not one of those men who are invited will get a taste of my banquet." The Pharisees, being the religious elite, would have expected to be there. They would have expected to have the prime seats. They were surely the ones that were going to take the seats of honour, as it were, at this messianic banquet. But Jesus says, no, that's not going to happen. One of the things we have to note, just again to get the context of this, is that they have basically invited Jesus to this banquet to watch him. First of all, to see whether he'd heal on the Sabbath. And we need to go back to what Jesus has said previously when he's talked about this concept of the messianic banquet. And we see that in chapter 13 and verse 29. People will come from the east and the west and north and the south and will take their place at the feast in the kingdom of God. Indeed, there are those who are last who will be first, and the first who will be last. What does this say to us today? Well, it tells us quite a lot. The Pharisees would have been, very proud of their religious devotion. And here's the thing. It doesn't matter whether we go to a big church. It doesn't matter if we hear eloquent sermons. It doesn't matter how often we take communion. It doesn't matter, in a sense, how often we read our Bible. The thing is, what's going on in the heart? These people all knew about the banquet. They'd all had their invite. We can broaden that. They'd had the message of the prophets. They would have had what we call the Old Testament. That's the invite of the coming Messiah. And yet they're all rejecting Jesus. Don't for a second think religious devotion is the same as having a relationship with Jesus. The key thing in the end that Jesus outlines is that sometimes it's the most unexpected people, the truly sorry, the truly repentant that God calls to be with him and who have peace with him. Thank you so much for listening.